Everyone is looking forward to hearing some comments by Shahra Razavi. I know I'm excited about it. We're going to hear some welcoming remarks from some UMass Lowell folks. And I want to give you a sense of why I've asked these particular people to speak with you tonight. Basically, it's because without these people, this summit literally would not be happening. So first, Meg Bond, who's the director of the Center for Women in Work. When I came to her almost 2 years ago to ask her if she was willing to entertain the idea of the Center for Women in Work becoming the institutional home for the Carework network, which, by the way, had existed only virtually for over 10 years and had no money. Meg not only said yes, but she said yes with enthusiasm. So thank you for being willing to take that chance on us. And we are very grateful to have the Center for Women in Work as an institutional home. It's allowed us to grow as a network in ways that we weren't able to when we didn't have a home base. Second, the Dean's Office of the College of Fine Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Dean Luis Falcon, who you're also going to hear from, not only provided financial support for this event, but also has been a wholehearted supporter from the beginning. And Associate Dean Andy Harris literally helped me navigate through to find the right person to talk to, which, as you all know, because many of you work at universities, can sometimes be challenging. So he was truly invaluable in working with us to help us navigate those parts of the university that I had not had to navigate before in my other roles. Third, you're going to hear from, and actually you're going to hear from these people in a different order than I'm saying them, but Vice Chancellor Julie Chen. Julie has been both a role model for women's leadership and an unwavering supporter of the Center for Women in Work throughout my career here at UMass Lowell. She didn't hesitate for an instant when I asked her for the financial and logistical support to host this conference here. And it is under her leadership that this university has grown by leaps and bounds in terms of our commitment to research and scholarship. And I'm grateful that she sees Carework as an important area in which to invest. Finally, our Chancellor, Jackie Maloney, who, as the first female chancellor of this institution, has set the tone of valuing all of women's contributions. She again was on board without hesitation in this endeavor, and by giving this event high priority in her own schedule, as well as in university publicity, she has supported this event and made it possible for us to have the broadest impact possible and the highest level of visibility possible to the community and the policy world. It's sunny. Third, we had a group of sponsors that made it possible for us to make this conference accessible by providing financial support. So we'd like to thank Rollins College, Touro School of Social Work, the Gerontology Institute at Georgia State University, Adelphi University, the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy at UMass Boston, and right here at UMass Lowell, our Center for Asian American Studies and Labor Studies program. So thank you to all of them for their financial support. Fourth, I would like to thank the United Teen Equality Center for hosting us here this evening and providing us with this delicious food. UTEC does amazing work here, and you're going to hear a little bit more about their work a little later in the evening. And we are delighted to be able to support their work and to have our event, our opening night event here. It makes it kind of doubly special. Last but not least, I would like to thank the staff of the Center for Women in Work. So Abraham, Chris, June, and Darcy, who are all over there. Wave, everyone. So especially Darcy really was an extraordinary co-planner on this end at the UMass Lowell end and worked in tandem with our steering committee to help us turn this vision into a reality. And also Elise, who's over there, Elise Gorzella, who is a student who is going to be taking some video of our conference and putting together a little highlights reel for us. So thank you to her. And also to the Lowell Telecommunications Corporation, who are also here and are going to be videoing the keynote address. So thank you to them as well. There are probably other people who I have forgotten to mention, but this was truly a collective effort, and a huge thank you to everyone who's been involved and to all of you for coming tonight. A couple of housekeeping things. Food and drinks are going to be out, so if you want to get up and get food and drink, I'm sure Shahra won't mind. And the other thing is I just wanted to point out there is a table over here that has books on it that are for sale, that are books written by people who are here at this event. So if you want to check that out, that book table will also be around over the next couple days. So if you want to check that out as well. Anything else we need to say? Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce Chancellor Jackie Maloney.
Thank you, Mignon, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the city of Lowell. It's so great to be here with people who care about care workers. And when Mignon first talked to me about this Global Carework Summit, I was so impressed to hear about your scholarship and the work that you're doing and the advocacy that you are doing on behalf of care workers. I would like to echo a number of thank yous that Mignon made, but first by starting and thanking Mignon Duffy and Jennifer Kraft Morgan for leading this important conference here in the city. I said to them when I walked in, having done a few of these conferences myself in different times along the way, and those of you who have know what a great relief it is when it all comes together. And the most important part, of course, their brilliance in starting you off with a nice cocktail, glass of wine, ordering this beautiful, beautiful spring weather, which we have not had a lot of in Massachusetts. I don't know where you're all from, but this day is pretty special. So having you here, but I think the most important thing, and they could sense in the room, was seeing the camaraderie here and the friendships already established through this network, which are so critically important to the work that you do. I'd also like to welcome our conference's two keynote speakers, Shahra, Razavi, thank you for being here. I'm sorry, I did that wrong. Shahra, thank you for being here. Of course, Shahra is from the United Nations Equity Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. And of course, Nancy Fulbright, sorry for that one. Where's Nancy? Thank you. I did have that one right. Okay, Nancy, who's from the Political Economy Research Institute at University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thank you for being here, both of you, for sharing your wisdom with this group, which I know you will both have some powerful messages that everyone can learn from. And before I go on, I just have to do just a quick infomercial, which I can never resist, and talking about our university. At UMass Lowell, we've undergone a remarkable transformation, we believe, in the past 10 years. But it's not just us. We are ranked the second fastest rising university in the country right now. We here, a public university located in the heart of a very challenged gateway city, this university has committed itself to a mission of social responsibility, caring for the other, making a difference in people's lives, committed to inclusion and the kind of diversity that you would see if you have a moment to walk through this city. Because of that, this university is also the ninth fastest growing, according to the Chronicle of Higher Education. Our research has tripled in just the past 10 years, tripled our international enrollment, increased our diversity of our students by 30%, and now are ranked the second in the country by the Education Trust Foundation for closing the achievement gap for students of color. Now, why are those things important to this organization and the work that you do today? Clearly, the care workers that you are focused on, the scholarship that you're focused on. Many of the students that we are committed to at this university are the care workers that you write about, that you research about, that you think about, that you advocate for. There's no doubt that the ideas that you share this weekend will, in some cases, challenge your thinking, stretch your thinking, likely inspire your thinking. But what's most important is you will show, by taking this conference to the next level, by convening a truly international conference, that you will be able to learn from each other, different cultures, different ideas, and we believe at UMass Lowell that is the route to enrichment. This is a message we all know that it is critically important that we think about our commitment to this global network. We all know here how important that is going to be going forward. We know that is what care workers, in fact, bring to the table, because so many of our care workers do come from different backgrounds, do come from different countries, and I think bring this richness, if we can tap into it, will really, I think, take this field to the next level. And then finally, just to say, as we know, here in the heart of this city, which is deeply committed and has its roots to supporting immigrant communities, refugee communities, and the city has changed so much. And I know some of you had a chance earlier to go on the tour with Bob Grant, and if you did, you also know that this city grew in some ways on the backs of the Mill City girls, the women who came here from farms and earned so little money for the work that they did that made the city great and rich, and many men powerful. We have so many lessons to learn from the history of Lowell that carry over to your field. So again, I applaud you for taking the time to share with each other. We know that the workers that you think about make a difference every day in so many people's lives. The work you do here will help us to understand their plight, their needs, and help us to improve their working conditions and their lives. I applaud all of you for your commitment to the study in this area and your dedication to understanding and improving the lives of care workers. I really hope that you enjoy your stay, get a chance to walk around the city. We know that you will learn a lot from each other, but hopefully also some takeaways about this great city of Lowell and our great university, UMass Lowell. And now it's my honor to introduce my great colleague, Julie Chen. I just want to say at UMass Lowell, we walk the walk. Our executive cabinet at UMass Lowell is now 70% women. Our senior cabinet is 50% women. We're really fortunate to have leaders like Meg Bond, who has actually been pushing us and helping us to stretch in this direction so many ways through the Center for Working for Women at Work. Thank you, Meg, for all of your work. Meg's an outstanding colleague. And Julie Chen, who is just an extraordinary, accomplished researcher in so many ways in her own field in mechanical engineering. She was the founder of our Nanotechnology Center, but also an incredible advocate for women in STEM fields. Julie and Meg recently, among a number of our accomplishments, she's got a very prestigious National Science Foundation grant, a $3.5 million grant to UMass Lowell to help us to advance women in science and engineering. Because of women like them, the National Science Foundation had confidence in this university to do that. So again, thank you all for being here. Good luck with the conference. I know it will be great. Continue to enjoy that great camaraderie that I saw when I walked in the room this evening. And please welcome Julie Chen, our Vice Chancellor.
So you heard all those great numbers, and with this kind of inspirational leadership, you can see why this university is growing so quickly and doing so well. So I just wanted to add 3 quick points with respect to particularly the research and scholarship here at this university. because I think that this conference, and particularly the Center for Women in Work, really reflects the DNA of what we believe in here at UMass Lowell when it comes to our research and scholarship. And I'm going to leave you with 3 points: community, interdisciplinary, and impact. And you can already see in this room today the effect of community on the next couple days, the community that you're going to build and that you've already built with this global care network. All of our centers, we focus on helping them to create a community so that it's not just come together when the money is here and leave when the money goes. It's supporting each other, it's sharing information, it's sharing ideas, it's creating new ideas because you're talking to people that you might not talk to on a daily basis. And that leads into the second one, which is interdisciplinary. It was commented to me, I think Min Young noted that in this room, Carework, right, requires people from all disciplines: psychology, sociology, economics, political science, because the difficult problems that we all face today require people from all different disciplines to come together to come up with those solutions. And for us at this university, we believe that also. The challenging problems that we face today, energy, environmental, safety, security, it takes people from all different disciplines to solve those challenging problems. And the third thing, which is so important, I think, I know to everybody in this room, impact. I think none of us here is about, let's do the research and hide it away somewhere and maybe someone will read it 20 years from now, right? It's about understanding what the problems are, understanding what the solutions might be, and understanding how we can implement those solutions in a way that's going to affect all of us in this community and in this global community. So it's a great, great, great thing to see all of you here. Congratulations to Min Young and all of the organizers. As the Chancellor said, this kind of event does not come together on the back of one person. It takes everybody working together. So I wish you a wonderful, wonderful conference, and hopefully you will enjoy and come back many more times to this campus, because we look forward to having you as part of our community. Thank you.
Let me first welcome you to UTech and also to UMass Lowell. This thing actually moves. I may do by like Sean Spicer. Let me say that I was talking to Andy Harris in the back, and I said, you know, Andy, why are there so many women in this room? And Andy, who's a wise guy, well, actually a wise man, not a wise guy, he said, no, the question is, why are there so few men in this room? And I think it's important to understand both the gender dimensions of some of the fields that we study, and also, as Julie mentioned, some of the interdisciplinary aspects that are essential to understand some of the complex problems that we face, not only in our society, but across the world. Let me tell you, I'm delighted to welcome you to our campus. Let me tell you a little bit about our college. We have the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, 11 academic departments in our college. About 200 faculty members, well over 4,000 undergraduate students and grad students. And a faculty that is growing by leaps and bounds, and largely due to the leadership of this university. I've been fortunate enough that in the now 5 years, on July 23rd at 9 in the morning, over 5 years that I've been here, I have been able to hire 58 new faculty members to my college in that short period of time. It has just been a major transformation of the university, and is particularly palpable in our college. And our faculty are just a tremendous faculty. This is one probably out of 4 or 5 national and international conferences that we have had in the last 2 years. Last year we had the Society for Analytical Feminism meet here. We had the National Conference on Community Research and Action. And later this summer, we will have the annual Southeast Asian American Studies Conference also here at UMass Lowell. And that is just evidence of the leadership role that many of our faculty take in national organizations and their creativity at bringing together scholars from a number of different disciplines to come to UMass Lowell and essentially produce a scholarship that is not only of significance, but is also of value to the community out there. I did spend some time looking through the program, and as Julie did, I noticed the fact that this is a truly interdisciplinary conference, but also it made me think a little more. I'm a sociologist by training, well, more of a demographer, but I do pass as a sociologist. Actually, one of my former PhD students is here today as one of the presenters in the conference. But it just, gave me a real good understanding as someone that studies demographic processes about the range of collaborations that are essential to understand care work and the study of those that are engaged in care work. From life cycle approaches that look at people who take care of children and the elderly, to economists that may look at the impact in the labor force of people being engaged in large numbers of the economy as informal workers in care work, to the fact that we have a very much gender occupation that has substantial impacts for the outcomes for a large number of the people in any given country in this world, because the patterns do not differ across countries in terms of the predominant impact of women in their job as care workers. To the fact that there are cultural practices that continue to rely primarily on women to assume these responsibilities for no pay whatsoever. And these are all very, very problematic issues for modern societies and for traditional societies as well. So it's really, really important to study it as a social problem, but also to understanding and come up with recommendations and potentially guide the process to affect change so that the value of care workers is actually taken in consideration across societies. So my point is that we are, as a college where the social sciences and the humanities are well represented, we're truly honored to have you on campus. We welcome you. We look forward to having you here for the next 2 or 3 days and to listen about the outcome of the conferences and the successes of the conference, because based on what I saw in the program is going to be, just the fact that all of you are here, and I know some of you have traveled long distances to be here, that in itself, that you took the time to come together and discuss important issues is already a success. So I thank you for being here. Look forward to hear more about the conference, and let me introduce Professor Meg Bond, a professor of psychology in our psychology department, director of the Center for Women and Work, and she wears many other hats, I would say, even though that's kind of a gender term too. But anyhow, Meg.
My turn to say welcome, and good news for you, this is your last welcome between our introduction and our wonderful keynote address. I do also have to begin by congratulating Mignon Duffy and Jennifer Kraft Morgan and their committed steering committee for all the hard work to pull this conference together. Well done, it's exciting, we're very pleased to have you here. As many of you know, and has been commented by others, the work of organizing a conference is way more work than it seems on the surface once you get there. So I also want to just briefly comment on how central care work, the ways in which care work is central to the mission of the Center for Women in Work. So CWW, as you've heard, is one of Lowell's really vital research centers, and we're a vibrant community of scholars across a very wide range of diverse disciplines, all dedicated to addressing gender-based workforce inequalities through research, through education, through advocacy and policy, and through institutional transformation. And while our work of this broader group of scholars is quite wide-ranging, we have a few areas that we consider our core research areas. And care work is one of those, and it is very important to us. And not only did Mignon play a key role in organizing this conference, but she heads up that whole area of research with a diverse group of scholars, and that is ongoing work, and many of you, I hope, know her scholarship. Our other areas are women in STEM, gendered violence, and intersections of race and gender in the workplace. And our overall rallying cry for CWW is advancing, quote, advancing scholarship for critical social change. So I hope you can see that collaborating on this conference fits squarely within our mission and is synergistic with our passion for making a difference. So that brings us around to feeling very proud as a center to be partners in helping convene this summit, and also, as Mignon mentioned, our new role in hosting and promoting the International Multidisciplinary Virtual Carework Network. So I want to leave you with 3 wishes from CWW in terms of your time at the conference. The first is we hope you learn much. You already are a group that are versed and knowledgeable, but if you're like me, conferences are a time to really benefit from being refreshed with new ideas and new perspectives from colleagues that you know, have the same passions. So that's my wish number 1. My second is that you really use the opportunity to network with all these wonderful like-minded scholars. And network to build support for your own work, but also we would be thrilled to know that new collaborations came out of this conference. So we very much hope you use the conference in that way. And the third wish that we have for you is to come away inspired and activated to further quality research and policy and advocacy on behalf of this incredibly important sector of our workforce. So on that note, let me just say, welcome to UMass Lowell, and let the conference begin.
So I hope you feel really welcome. We're so excited to have you here, but we want to get on with the program and get to our keynote speaker. We're really excited about this. As a member of the Carework Network Steering Committee, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. As we were planning this Global Carework Summit, we were looking for a dynamic speaker with a truly international perspective. We believe we've secured exactly the right person. We hope you agree. Shahra Razavi is Chief of the Research and Data Section at the UN Women, where she is Research Director of UN Women's flagship report, Progress of the World's Women. She specializes in the gender dimensions of development with a particular focus on work, social policy, and care. Her recent publications include Seen, Heard, and Counted, Rethinking Care in a Developmental Context, Underpaid and Overworked, a cross-national perspective on care workers, and the gendered impacts of liberalization towards embedded liberalism. Shahra received her bachelor's in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and her master's and doctorate in agricultural economics from Oxford University. And without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Shahra Razavi.
For that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here in Lowell, and I do want to thank the many individuals who were involved in creating the network, in organizing this conference. And in particular, I would like to thank Mignon Duffy for, in many ways, for her scholarship, for her generosity of spirit, and her very welcoming ways of having asked me to be here at this conference. I must say, after having accepted Mignon's invitation, because I've always enjoyed reading her work and I thought it would be great to be at the event, I later felt a little bit concerned about having agreed to speak to a group of people who are specialists of the field, thinking, oh my goodness, these are researchers, academics who've been working in this area with great expertise, and worrying a little bit about what I can say, which will be of wide interest maybe to this group sitting in where I'm sitting, which is within the UN. What would I have to sort of say to a group who are experts in this area? So I hope that you will take what I have to say not as a keynote. A keynote made me feel a bit nervous. I would say more it's a conversation. I will just be giving a few reflections based on some of the work that I've been doing myself, and also the work that we do at UN Women. And specifically to say that at the global level there's a lot of excitement at the moment, because care which has been seen as an issue traditionally associated with welfare states in developed countries, has kind of emerged on the development agenda. And this is really what I want to talk a little bit about in terms of how this work is now being reflected in some of the new global normative frameworks that exist, about which you may not have heard necessarily, but it's a big issue in the UN at the moment and within the global kind of policy community. And yet also it's coming at a time when in many ways there are many restrictions and many constraints within which to really be able to take bold steps forward in terms of supporting care work, supporting care workers, and supporting the care economy. So it's a bit of what I see is we're at a moment which is very exciting in some ways because ideas have emerged and policy proposals are on the table, and yet at the same time, you know, the kind of changes that the global economy is going through are making it very difficult to take this vision forward. So those are some of the reflections that I'd like to share with you. So let me begin by pointing first to a concern that many of us have. We do, I think we all share an understanding that care is foundational to human well-being, to societies, to creating human capability and flourishing. Also essential for, in a more sort of a mechanistic way, if you like, for reproducing labor that is very much the bedrock of all economic activity. And yet, I think many of us worry about the fact that care is mired in such intense inequalities, both in terms of who receives care and also in terms of who provides care. In many ways, inequalities within the larger society are often reflected in the way care arrangements are made in many different societies, and those particular arrangements in turn tend to reinforce many of the existing inequalities, which seems to be contrary to notions of social justice and equity and equality and gender equality in particular, as well as in many ways one can argue it's also economically suboptimal, and I think that gives us the sort of broad picture. So in the time that I have, I will try to locate the issue of care inequality in different kind of national jurisdictions, and I want to start with a developed country kind of snapshot, if you like, and then move on to talk about some of the exciting policy developments in developing countries before turning to some of the transnational dynamics that I think are particularly disconcerting at this moment. I want to begin with what is perhaps very familiar to many of you, so do excuse my very pedestrian kind of attempt to understand the US care system. And in talking about the US, I'm not focusing in all the different areas of care. My focus is rather narrow in terms of early childhood education and care services. And I take this particular issue to look at partly because it's an issue that also reverberates across the globe, because this is also an area where policy developments in some developing countries are beginning to take shape. So it's a kind of common area. It's also in some ways, as I see it, a bit of a low-hanging fruit, because one can bring not only arguments around social justice, but also arguments around, if you like, human capital or social investment to make strong policy pleas in terms of much greater support for early childhood education and care systems. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the sort of liberal democracies. Now, first of all, these liberal democracies, as we know, pride themselves in providing equality of opportunity, especially for children. And yet, as Anne Phillips has persuasively argued, if a society is seriously committed to equalizing opportunities, it will have to incorporate at least some elements of outcome equality, which is now seen as somewhat old-fashioned. It has in fact become part of the common sense in most countries to recognize the importance, in fact, of, for opportunities, in order to make opportunities really equal, the importance of being able to neutralize in some way some of the inequitable effects of people's social background. Through redistributive measures that, for example, would allocate more resources to the education and care of poor children from inner cities so that they reach the same level of qualification and capability as upper middle class children from the suburbs. Now, evidence from a wide range of countries, developed countries, show that children who have had exposure to preschool education tend to do better at school, and that many of these benefits are long-lasting. In fact, this is from a lot of research that was done in the US, by people like Heckman and others who have shown some of these benefits. Now, given the critical importance of the early years to a child's development and their later life chances, especially in the case of children from socially disadvantaged backgrounds for whom early childhood education services seem to make the most difference, there should be particular concern about equalizing the provision of services that are accessible, affordable, and meet quality standards to children, universally to all children, but in particular to children from socially marginalized groups. And I think one can make this argument very persuasively, not only on grounds of social justice and rights of the child, but also in terms of, if you like, social investment in a valuable public good, in the way that also Nancy Folborough has done in her work, talking about it as an important public good. Now, this agenda of making quality childhood education and care widely available from a child right perspective or child development perspective nicely coincides also with another key element that many liberal economies pride themselves in, which is in terms of equalizing opportunities so that both women and men can reconcile paid work with their unpaid family responsibilities. Now, we know very well engaging in low-paid, precarious work with long working hours is not necessarily an empowering experience, especially if at the same time one's child is in substandard care that eats up a good chunk of one's salary or wage. So therefore, given the significant inequalities among women in terms of education, in terms of labor market opportunities, that exist, a strong case again can be made for ensuring the universal availability of accessible, quality, affordable childcare services. However, delivering on this very important sort of double dividend, if you like, and very importantly, one can even talk about a triple dividend if we add to this the ways in which support for care services can also enable better wages and better working conditions for care workers. There really is a triple dividend there. This has not necessarily been universally achieved, even in very high-income developed countries. And here I want to say a little bit about some of the differences, which many of you would know, even within the sort of group of high-income countries. Systems of provision and policies that underpin them vary considerably across national jurisdictions, with some countries enjoying a very strong tradition of universal nursery education, for example, as in the case of countries like France, as well as Nordic countries, while the Anglo-Saxon countries have tended to sort of lag behind, possibly with the exception of Australia here. And in a study that I'm drawing on, and I think the figures already there, for 8 high-income countries by Gambaro and colleagues, and the countries are, as you can see, Australia, France, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, the UK, and the US. We see that in many ways the US seems to stand out, not only because it has one of the highest GDPs per capita here, but as you can see, it is the highest actually, yes, with the exception of Norway. But also, surprisingly, relatively high rates of child poverty, around 22%, high rates of lone parenthood, around 26%, and female employment rates that stands at around 70%. That is not particularly high, at least compared to this group, although for the OECD it's somewhere close to the average. Which, everything else being equal, you would think points to the potential importance and strategic importance of investments in early childhood education and care services. Given that most mothers are back at work before their child's first birthday, given that paid maternity leave is not available for large numbers of working women in this country, and that children do not start school until about age 5. This leaves a substantial amount of time that children need care if their parents are working outside of the home, especially given the high prevalence of non-standard work with very irregular hours. So you could really make a strong case for the importance of universal early childhood education and care services. However, as we see from the next slide, the US has relatively this was on the employment rate, and then we can move on to the next slide. The US has relatively low enrollment rates in ECSE services, 31% for those under 3, 36%, 58%, and 73% for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, compared to near universal coverage for children 3 years and older in France, and even in the UK, which has not had the same history as France in terms of childcare provision, which have had rollout of free preschool programs in recent years in the case of UK. So the picture looks for the US slightly better. I kind of brought an update, which is on the next slide, of data for the US, where you can see that there is a slight sort of improvement compared to the previous slide. Now, one constant feature of the US policy framework for early childhood education and care, which has not changed much over the past decades, is its heavy reliance on market provision. And here I think there's a lesson for other countries, developing countries in particular, that are trying to catch up and develop early childhood education and care systems. Now, despite some expansion of childcare subsidies and some public provision of childcare in US, public support remains fairly limited compared to other developed countries. And research shows that low-income families in the US typically do not benefit, for example, from things like tax credits, and while they may be eligible for subsidies and also for some of the public programs like Head Start, these are not entitlements. While funding, for example, for Head Start grew in the 1990s, it has stagnated since then, and with the growth in child poverty, it only reaches about half of eligible 3- and 4-year-olds. So the story there is not necessarily a very positive one. Of course, there are new types of public provision in this country, one which I live in New York City, and many of my colleagues are very excited about the pre-K provision that is now available in New York City, which is funded and administered by local public schools and that offer either on-site or through other cooperating agencies provision, pre-kindergarten provision. And in a handful of states, the program has universal scope. And by 2011, these pre-K services served about 28% of 4-year-olds, although, as we know, often they're in a sort of part-time programs. Now, given this kind of patchwork of provisions, estimates suggest that something like 50% of children in non-parental care under the age of 6 are placed in informal care arrangements. That means either it's relatives, babysitters, nannies, many other informal care workers who do the care work for these children. Now, many parents say they prefer informal care because it's more flexible and cheaper, but as many of you know very well, there are concerns regarding the quality of care in some cases, and also concerns about the terms and conditions under which some of that work is being offered in terms of workers' rights. Many of whom, as you know, would be migrant women with uncertain immigration status, a theme that I'll return to in a few minutes. Now, given this limited public funding available and the minimal role of employers and heavy reliance on markets, it should not come as a surprise that low-income families are the ones who fare worse in terms of access, in terms of quality of service, and in terms of affordability of care services. In terms of access, enrollment rates for children enrolled in preschool is considerably higher for the top 2 income quintiles compared to the middle and lower income groups. And in terms of quality, generally low-income children tend to attend ECEC services that are of lower quality, measured in terms of global process measures of quality, and ironically also in terms of affordability. Although low-income families are more likely to use informal and lower quality arrangements, when they pay for care, they tend to pay more as a share of their income compared to higher income groups. Single mothers in particular tend to pay more than married couple families. So these inequalities in terms of access, in terms of quality, and in terms of affordability, I think sort of illustrate one of the points that Joan Tronto has been making about the vicious circles of privatized caring, where kind of the lottery of birth, the family into which a child is born, determines her or his life chances, feeding the kind of intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. Furthermore, low-income women have to make difficult trade-offs between their income security and their own sort of financial independence and the quality of care their children receive, which is hardly a kind of a feminist notion of choice. And as many of you have argued, and as Janet Gornick and Marcia Mayers persuasively showed in their book-length study more than a decade ago, paid maternity and family leave and universal early childhood education and care programs are the way to go. And there are many useful lessons now from other developed countries that a country like the US can learn in order to design programs. What stands in the way? It's not economics, it's politics, as we know, and this is something that I'm kind of beginning to learn by living in this country for the past 4 years. And I hope that in the discussion we can talk a little bit more about some of the things that are sort of playing out as we speak in terms of the changing politics and what the fallouts of that may be for the expansion of some of the programs that exist in this country. So let me now turn very briefly to Latin America. I just think it's important to say that some of the more exciting social policy developments of the past decade have taken place in regions that are not part of the global core. And in fact, the global periphery has kind of become a little bit of an exciting area where a lot of interesting social policy innovations have been taking place over the past decade. And Latin America, as a region that's marked by very strong income and wealth inequalities, stands out as a particularly interesting sort of region to look at. But also East Asia, which historically, I think many of us as feminists have kind of associated the region with a very strong kind of familialism and very strong patriarchal sort of social norms, also has seen a lot of, I think, very exciting social policy developments, particularly in the area of both childcare and long-term care. And I'll just say a little bit about that, and I hope that we can have time again in the discussion for more sort of discussion around some of those developments. Now, from a global perspective, Latin America stands out for a number of interesting features. First, in terms of it has seen, over the past decade, an increase in female labor force participation in a way that globally has been quite unique, because it has happened at a time where in many other regions there has been either stagnation or a reversal, a slowdown in female labor force participation. Still, the gender gaps are huge. In 2014, female labor force participation was 56% in the region compared to 85% male labor force participation. Nevertheless, keep that in mind that we are seeing this change. Secondly, a drop in the proportion of women without an income of their own. When in 2002, 40% of women had no income of their own. By 2014, this had dropped to 30%. And this is shown in the next slide. So from 2002 to 2014, quite a significant reduction in proportion of women without an income of their own, partly a reflection of the rising labor force participation that we saw, but also as a result of some new social policy provisions like conditional cash transfers, but also non-contributory social pensions, which have expanded in some countries. Another thing we see in the region is an increase in the proportion of households where a woman is the main income provider, from something like 28% in 2002 to something like 32% in 2014. Now, despite some progress, I mean, let's also be clear that there are not only change, but also some continuity in the continent, and I'm sure that many of the experts who are here from the region can elaborate the issues in also some of the sessions that we're having over the next couple of days. There has been some progress in terms of inequality. But also very importantly, let me just point to a couple of the sort of remaining issues that are of particular concern. For example, whether we think in terms of some of these sort of usual indicators, whether it's women's labor force participation, whether it's time women allocate to unpaid domestic and care work, or whether it's proportion of women who dedicate themselves exclusively to unpaid care and domestic work, there are stark inequalities if you look across income quintiles. This is drawing the next slide on a report that UN Women did, Progress of the World's Women in Latin America and Caribbean, that was just launched this March at the Commission on Status of Women, where some of these indicators we looked at, and we made the scenario of women on the sticky floors, broken ladders, and women under the glass ceiling. And what you see, I'm sorry, the indicators here are a bit clearer, but on the next slide, not so clear. So women on the sticky floors, which are basically women who are in the lowest income quintile, labor force participation is around 40%. Hours, weekly hours of unpaid care and domestic work, 46 hours. Percentage of women who dedicate themselves exclusively to homemaking, 41%. Now compare that to women in under the glass ceiling, which is the highest income quintile. Labor force participation, 72%. Hours of unpaid care work per week, 33 hours. And percentage of women who devote themselves to homemaking exclusively, 16%. So again, you see the sort of different scenarios for different groups of women. Sorry, next slide. So, yeah, those figures are too small to see, but some indicators for the three different scenarios. Now, having said this, nevertheless, it is interesting how significantly governments in the region have, sometimes they've been pushed by civil society, sometimes it has been more of a technocratic kind of, if you like, government approach, necessarily not without much pressure from civil society, how they've moved forward and invested in public care services, particularly early childhood education and care services. And if we move to the next slide, it shows the expansion of preschool for the 4 to 5 year old coverage over a decade or so, with some reduction in the inequalities between rural and urban areas, but also socioeconomic inequalities narrowing to some extent in terms of access. Now, Chile in particular is one country that stands out for having made significant investments in the expansion of public childcare services, very importantly, particularly for children under the age of 4, 0 to 3 year olds, from 2006 onwards. And this was a very important pillar of Michelle Bachelet's social policy agenda. And a colleague of mine who did her PhD on social policy innovations in Chile has explained very well why, I don't have time to go into the details, but why in particular in Chile, the provision of 0 to 3 early childhood education and care took a very strong public, provision, as opposed to leaving it to the market, which was the way that Chilean education system is generally quite strong in terms of market provision. And the argument seems to be that it was very much the skepticism about the benefits of vouchers and marketization in the education sector that pushed sort of the government to really try and innovate a bit with this new area of service provision by going for very strong public provision. So these childcare centres are staffed by salaried early childhood education and care professionals, centrally funded and regulated but locally run, and largely they're run by municipalities with some delegation to not-profit providers. Access is provided free of charge and for children from households within the bottom 60% of the population. So it's not universal services, but it's pretty broad targeting. It's not very narrow targeting, 60%. As a result, coverage among children 5 years old and younger has gone up from around 37% in 2006 to 49% in 2015, while the gap between children from the bottom and top income quintiles declined from around 15 to about 8 percentage points. So again, a sort of fairly positive turnout. How am I doing in terms of time? It's okay, meaning halfway through your...
You've got at least 25 minutes.
Okay. Now this expansion of early childhood education and care in Chile is interesting, but also lower income countries like Ecuador have also had pretty significant improvements in terms of coverage among children 5 years and younger. And in this particular case, it was by building on and strengthening the kind of free community-based early childhood education and services that was being provided in the country. I won't say more about that. Let me just say that in both countries, the expansion of these early childhood education services has been financed through general tax revenue. However, despite such institutional innovations, I think it's important to remember this is still a region with very significant inequalities. And there is that legacy that goes on. And we see elements of continuity in the important ways in which paid domestic work continues to be very important in Latin America. Now, if you move to the next slide. Yeah, this provides kind of, in terms of just numbers of domestic workers, the region is home to something like 20 million domestic workers, many of whom, as we know, perform not only so-called, paid domestic work, but also paid care work, caring for children, for elderly people, for sick people in people's homes. And as you can see from the slide, paid domestic workers are making up not a declining share of the workforce, but a rising share of the workforce. 7.6% in 2010, which is one of the highest in the world. And female domestic workers also constitute a significant proportion of the female workforce, something like 17%, which is one of the highest in the world. The other one is Middle East, which has about 20% of female workers or domestic workers. And if you look at female wage workers, an even bigger percentage of domestic workers among them. And the next slide draws on a recent paper by Fernando. Sorry, yes. It's gonna come up. By Fernando Filguera and Juliana Martinez, who show that reliance on paid domestic work is, again, as we would expect, very different across different income quintiles. From a low of about 10%, it's actually even lower than 10%, it's about 4% of households in the two lower income quintiles who use domestic workers, to close to 50% in the top quintile, which they say, and I would also think that is most definitely an underestimate, because very often it's not declared that people employ domestic workers, and something like 100% among the top 1%. And what they show is that also with data from Uruguay, that most of the domestic workers employed by the top quintile come from that bottom two quintiles. So the challenge of formalizing paid domestic work continues to be a major one, and I think has been given much more kind of resonance with the passage of the ILO, as we know, Convention on Domestic Work, which has had an increasing number of ratifications. And Uruguay, again, is a very interesting country, which is trying to formalize paid domestic work, increase wages, to improve working conditions, and at the same time is also building a care system within which paid care services are being supported. And the idea is, according to Filguera and Martinez Franzoni, that the expansion of early childhood education and care services in particular would in part be also drawing on would be using some of the domestic workers, retraining them and using them as salaried care workers in some of the new care system that is being built up. Now, how far that's going to happen, I think, remains to be seen. And I would like to just say a few words about East Asia before turning to some of the global challenges. And what I do want to say about East Asia, as I alluded a bit earlier, is that we often think of Japan and Korea as countries where families have been very central to care provisioning, and that have very strong social norms around the importance of care provision within the family, particularly for children, but also very much for elderly people. And yet we see that both countries over the past decade or so, for a number of reasons, some of it has to do with demographic change, obviously, but also in both countries quite strong activism on the part of women, feminist movements, have made significant efforts to sort of socialize the costs of long-term care through the adoption of mandatory long-term care insurance policy. This happened in Japan in the year 2000 and in Korea 8 years later, which is subsidized by the government and finances a range of long-term care services in both countries. And early indications suggest that the provision of these services has had a positive implication in terms of the reduction of unpaid care work within family by unpaid family workers. But also, what is, I think, quite interesting is that the provision is fairly heavily regulated and tends to provide work that is relatively better regulated than in many other countries. Still, you have the hierarchies in the labor market, and in particular, long-term care workers are on the lower echelons of that hierarchy. But the conditions of work are much better than in sort of more liberalized, let's say, Southeast Asian economies, where long-term care is being provided by migrant care workers, and it's being employed by families, and very under-regulated in that context. So some interesting issues to look there, and I'm drawing on the work of Itu Peng in particular, who has done some very interesting work in this area, looking at both Japan and South Korea, and comparing that to some of the other countries in the region, which have much more kind of liberal market economies as far as care is concerned. So let me now just very briefly turn to some of the global dynamics. I mean, what I've said so far about sort of a little snapshot of the US, a little bit about Latin America, a few words about East Asia, I think could be faulted for its kind of methodological nationalism. You know, it's very much looking at, you know, countries as self-contained countries. I've not said much about the global dynamics of care, a theme that has attracted a lot of attention over the past decade or so. Much of this interest has been about the sort of causes that underpin the growth of these global care chains, its dynamics, its impacts across borders, the impacts on women care workers who are being employed you know, across these chains. And it has been widely sort of used to show the way in which global inequalities, on the one hand, neoliberal kind of policies and gender regimes kind of collude, if you like, to create a systematic transfer of caring labor from the global south to the global north. And to use the supply and demand metaphor, I think much of the literature has been concerned about showing how gendered migration has been focused on the demand side. Why is it that many developed countries seem to be having increasing demand for care work, which is being nurtured through these global, sort of these women global care workers who become available in high-income countries. You know, issues around demographic aging have been talked about, the fact that increasing rates of female labor force participation means, you know, more care work is being needed, paid care work is needed, neoliberal policies and gender regimes, neoliberal policies such as allowances and vouchers, which allow households to hire care. All of these have been seen as kind of, you know, coming together and in a way enabling the way in which poor women from poorer countries and regions come and get employed by more affluent families and households, and also institutions in more developed countries. I think there has been less attention in this literature on the forces that are propelling women, if you like, on the supply side. You know, what are the forces that are pushing women and enticing them to come and become care workers in richer, more affluent countries? And of course, part of it is to do with inequalities and the fact that, you know, income inequalities have something to do with it, but also, you know, I think it's about inequalities in a broader sense of the term. If we think about sort of inequalities in living standards, the way in which livelihood options are very limited and restricted in many countries, and also the way in which education and health services have been underfunded in many developing countries, and also issues around physical and social insecurity, which are propelling people to move. And we see this now in the, you know, more recent waves of, you know, migration and refugee flows that are coming from across the Mediterranean. Now, global institutions, in particular, I think, you know, global institutions, the IFIs, the international financial institutions, have highlighted the fact that remittances are now outperforming, you know, overseas development assistance or aid, and that this is seen as a sort of positive thing for development. And I think the problem with this narrative is that it kind of obscures the way in which migration of labor and of care labor in particular is a response to uneven development. Yes, but also it does little to really address those inequalities and unevenness. And in fact, in many ways, it reinforces it. And nowhere, I mean, can we see these dynamics more clearly than in the global nursing care chains, which many people have been writing about. Nicola Yates is one person who's done some really interesting research on these global nurse chains, and how, as she has shown, countries who are at the top of this chain are constantly getting new recruits and supplying and having their nurse systems, their medical systems supplied with new nurse care workers. But countries at the bottom end of the nursing chain are the ones that are really facing problems and having difficulties replenishing their supply of nurses. And we see this, I think it came out very, very painfully in the whole context of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa, where in many ways, ironically, what we saw was that the underfunded African health systems were losing nurses all the time. From Tanzania, nurses were going to South Africa. From South Africa, they were going to UK National Health Service, to Canada, to the US. And yet, a country like Tanzania had real difficulties responding to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and itself had to recruit so-called voluntary home-based care workers, women who were just paid very small stipends to go from house to house and attend to very sick people in the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So these nursing flow chains, I think, obviously continue to attract new recruits, even though many nurses who migrate may experience de-skilling. And also the decision to migrate, we also have to really see it. Yes, it may be a choice, but it's also a very restrained choice for many women. And not necessarily a very meaningful one, when the choice is about, as we know, choosing between having a decent standard of living and having a family life. And the whole sort of literature is replete with, stories of women who leave behind children, who leave behind, spouses, elderly parents, and migrate in order to be able to afford schooling for their children or healthcare. Now, obviously, the appropriate response is not to impose restrictions on people's right to migrate, but to really try and steer development in a new direction, in particular in countries that are supplying this unlimited supply of care workers who come and work under very difficult conditions. So what is the path? What is the way forward? And I now want to sort of very briefly turn to some of the new policy developments in the global arena that seem to be, at least on the surface, these are normative responses, but responding to the sort of situation that the world finds itself in now, of increasing inequalities, of unsustainability in many different ways, unsustainability of societies, unsustainability in terms of our interactions with the environment, and what we have had in the past sort of 3-4 years at the global level has been a very big global conversation around, so what should the new development agenda be? Some of you may have heard about it. This is called the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a big thing in the UN. We spend all our time talking about it. So I'm sure in this conference we're not going to hear much about it. But it is, and I guess at some level, even though we're all like in the UN committed to and convinced that this is going to change the world, in some ways, I think, if we believe there is any positive force to come from some kind of normative framework at the global level, then I think it's important to look and see what this framework is saying. And a lot of energy and time by social movements, global social movements, southern movements, has gone into trying to get issues into this agenda that we feel are really important. And what is particularly exciting is not only that among these sustainable development goals, there are 17 of them, we have goal 5 that's on gender equality, but also it's very exciting that in the goal 5 there is a particular target that's on care work, on care systems. Now the rise, I think, and I think the next slide, so it's recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure and social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and the family. We don't like to say the last part of it, which, as you can see, was a compromise. As nationally appropriate means it's up to countries what they do. So it's a way of watering down whatever the rest of that target says. It was very hard fought. Every word in that target was very hard fought. And there were many strong feminists coming from different countries, being a part of the negotiations that were going on in trying to get care onto the agenda. And as I think, this one, many of us who've been at these global negotiations thought was amazing that it actually appeared as a target in the new agenda. In the Beijing Platform for Action, we didn't have much on care. So this is something that has happened since 1995, and I think it's very exciting. But as I said, we have now this global framework, which is really exciting, but it's happening in a world where the challenges are many. And let me just highlight a couple of things that I think are particularly disconcerting at this moment. That we have this amazing agenda that has everything on it, education, water and sanitation, basic infrastructure, which for many developing countries is absolutely essential as a precondition for care work. How can you do care work if you don't have piped water in the house? So big issues that need to be resolved. But all of these, whether it's healthcare, education, water, sanitation, renewable energy, they're all in this agenda, this amazing agenda. How is all this going to be financed? Where is the investment going to come from? And this is something that, now there's a lot of debate and contention about this. Because on the one hand, this is happening, the agenda is to be implemented in a context where we have not only austerity, global austerity, but also very big reservations about the usefulness of public provisioning for care, and very strong voices saying, let the private sector come in and we can have public-private partnerships which can address many of these deficits. There's some really big questions whether these big public-private partnerships are going to go into the care sector and what actually is happening if it does go into the care sector. The evidence shows that even in something like water and sanitation, public-private partnerships are not there. Even in terms of infrastructure, they tend to go to richer countries, more middle-income countries, and into things like telecoms, but not into water and sanitation. Water and sanitation, especially for poor, rural, remote communities, is predominantly financed by public finance. So resources available to governments, we know they're not fixed. They're determined by tax policies, by international assistance for many poorer countries, by decisions over deficit spending, by management of debt, monetary policy, financial regulation, and so forth. And in this particular context of this agenda, there was also big discussions in 2016 and 2015 around financing, which is another important area for development cooperation. And the emphasis in both agendas has been on domestic resource mobilization. Countries have to mobilize resources domestically. This is kind of coming out very strongly. Increase your taxes, do the job domestically. That's what you need to do. Which in many ways, I think for many developing countries, the emphasis on needing to mobilize resources domestically is a welcome point, because it means less dependence on aid, which we know is not increasing. If anything, it's declining, and often it tends to come tied with certain conditionalities. So on the one hand, it's very, very exciting, but on the other hand, it's also somewhat problematic, because without recognizing that the international context has a huge bearing on the ability of governments, particularly developing country governments, to actually be able to mobilize resources domestically. And here, let me just point to a couple of barriers that are particularly worrying. One is sort of illicit financial flows, about 80% of which come from cross-border tax evasion and capital flight through tax avoidance, which has been estimated by this Global Financial Integrity. They estimate that these illicit financial flows are around $1 trillion. They were estimated to be $1 trillion in 2013 alone. Now compare this figure to the estimate that WHO gives of having financing requirements for making water and sanitation universally available. It's $32 billion. So the sums of money that are being lost are huge, which could have been, invested in many of these services, in infrastructure, in making also services, in supporting services, health services, care services. These outflows, of course, we know are facilitated by offshore secrecy, low tax jurisdictions, which make it difficult for countries to protect their revenue base. And of course, it affects all countries, but for developing countries, they're particularly dire because they tend to have very low tax base. compared to many OECD countries. At the same time, we also have this tax competition between corporations, which again works out really to the disadvantage of all countries, but particularly developing countries. And also, I think what the other issue we have is that many developing countries, if you look broadly, developing countries have been transferring resources from south to north, rather than aid going from north to south. There has been a huge outflow of resources, which is about $500 billion in 2016, which is largely due to investments abroad. And the reason why these developing countries are investing abroad, part of it is in order to protect themselves against a sudden financial crisis. So part of it is kind of an insurance mechanism. So they're investing money in US Treasury bonds, and in effect, what is happening is that those public resources, which could have been invested in care services and infrastructure, are going from south to north. So we have a very peculiar kind of global context within which these finance flows are happening. And it is in this context that we're hearing more and more this idea that, well, you can increase your domestic resource mobilization, but in a way, the only way to go is to rely on private finance. And this is becoming a really big kind of debate within the global circles in terms of the extent to which whether private financial flows can really be counted on to be investing in the kind of sectors and services that are badly needed. So let me bring it all back home. I think these international financial flows, as we know, are not gender neutral. They are, in fact, detrimental for gender equality when they divert resources away from investments in public services and infrastructure that are vital for achieving gender equality, for sustaining care systems, and for ensuring that care services are providing quality services and decent work conditions for those who provide those services. And as 3 decades of accumulated research on macroeconomics and gender equality has shown, public fiscal constraints, whether they're induced by structural adjustment policies or austerity measures, impact disproportionately on women. As those with low personal incomes and fewer assets and smaller savings, women are more likely than men to rely on public services and public transfers to meet their own needs. As unpaid care providers, when investments in infrastructure are not there or are cut back and services are eroded, then we know that the burden of coping falls disproportionately on women. And also, as paid workers in public care services, they're often the ones who are either being lost or losing their jobs or facing very deteriorating working conditions and wages. So fixing this broken global financial architecture and ensuring that investments in infrastructure and care services are seen as what they are, investments in public goods and not just mere consumption, and that have long-term benefits, I think is going to be an uphill battle in a world that in many ways says all the right words, and this agenda says all the right things, and yet it's coming into collision with the reality of finance and of economic policies that only seems to be going in the opposite direction. So we are at a collision course, but there is an agenda, there is a wealth of experience, and I think there are many movements out there that have been mobilized around care in particular, movements that were mobilized around the domestic worker convention of the ILO, which are there at the global level, and much more importantly, which have used the global words and global normative frameworks to push their governments for taking action. So on that front, I think the agenda is positive in that hopefully it gives an ammunition to movements to lobby their governments and tell them, look, you've signed up to this agenda, care is on the agenda, you now need to do something about it. But what actually governments, particularly developing country governments, are able to do within the straitjackets that they have, I think, is a much harder question. So let me end there, and thank you very much for bearing with me